if you have something long in your email address, maybe it's andrew.allemann@something.computer, that gets to be pretty long, right? So I would think about that as well. There are plenty of short domain extensions, top level domains, but there are some that are longer. And again, I would just say if you go with one of the longer ones, make sure that the second level domain name you can get is shorter.
Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of the Ecommerce Traffic and Conversion Podcast. I'm Scott Branley. I'm here with my co-host DJ Sprague and our special guest, Andrew Allemann. Andrew, how are you doing today, man?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me on the show.
Yeah, we're glad you're here.
Yeah, and I get to introduce you, Andrew. So Andrew Allemann lives in the Seattle area, and he's been in the domain industry since 1997, which is way back. He's been quoted in the New York Times, Financial Times, Wall Street Journal, TechCrunch, Washington Post, Bloomberg, the Sydney Morning Herald, NPR, Fortune, Guardian, and other major publications. So well known in the media space. He creates and or manages and supports niche media websites. He's also the founder, editor, and publisher of Domain Name Wire. You got to check that out. Founded in 2005 as the first daily news blog covering the domain name business, and followed by the DNW podcast. So again, welcome to the show, Andrew. We're excited to have you.
Yeah, me too. I always love talking about domain names.
That's funny that you started out in 97, because that's about when I started doing stuff on the internet too.
Oh, yeah? Yeah. I mean, back then I was in college and on a dial-up connection in the dorm. And I remember moving into this dorm and there were about 1,000 people lived in this dorm. But there were only 30 outgoing phone connections because it used to be that you would, just use it for phones. So it would take hours just to get connected on your dial-up connection to the internet. So the world has changed a lot in the ensuing decades. So.
Oh, yeah. Okay. I started out, I made a website where I sold like t-shirts and stuff. But back then they didn't even have a shopping cart. No. So we started out literally with a landing, like a one web page with drawings of t-shirts and a phone number at the bottom of the
page. Yep. It's a lot of things have gotten so much easier around e-commerce, the ability to spin up a store in minutes and that sort of thing. And these kids today don't know how good they've got it, right?
Right. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, the old pioneers here.
Yeah.
Well, that's cool, man. It's nice to meet somebody from back in the startup days. But
right.
So, I mean, I eventually found my path in software, but it looks like you went into the domain name world. So how did you get into that?
Yeah, back in college in the late 90s, of course, it was the .com boom was underway there, especially as you went in the 98, 99 and then the infamous 2000 when it all started to crumble. But I was creating websites and I needed domain names to do that, right? And some people were selling names for a lot of money back then too. So I would go register domain names, and they were expensive back then too. They're about $70, which for a college kid was about a keg of beer, right? So there were some pretty big trade-offs to be made. And so I registered a handful, but not nearly enough. And after college, I went to work for a tech company. But around 2005, I started just writing about domain names on my site at domainnamewire.com. And that's kind of how I get into it on a more full-time basis. I do buy and sell domain names. That's one of my businesses, but also the ad-supported blog became another large part of that. And I've done other stuff throughout the years. That's not the only thing I've been working on. Startup. I'm an entrepreneur. I start up companies here and there, but that's been I'd say my identity has been mostly around domain names. So on my blog, I write 2, 3, 4 posts a day. And people say you can write that much about domain names, but there's actually quite a bit going on in this business.
Yeah, which begs the next question. Why is the right domain name and extension so important? I mean, obviously that's your core business. And a lot of people kind of look past it a little bit, but these days with so many extensions and all the options, why is it right Or I should say, why is it important to get it right?
Yeah, I mean, so there are two parts to the name that are important. There's the part to the left of the dot and to the right of the dot. And the part to the right of the dot is what we call the top level domain, or the extensions. It would be kind of a more colloquial term for that. And the part to the left, like shopper approved, would be the second level domain. And it's really important for a number of reasons. So one is your name connotes trust and credibility, right? If you are jacksonlinecarsales.com, that's not going to give the trust that, say, cars.com would have, right? That instant trust there. And there's also the recognition of the name. And so can people remember it and come back to it? Can they spell it? So if you have a cute spelling in your name and they might end up on a competitor's website, that sort of thing. And then we also have what we call the radio test in choosing a domain name, which is if someone hears it, can they actually type that? Can they put that into, type that into Chrome or Safari and go to the page? And so all those sorts of things add up, right? You've got the trust and credibility of the name. You have the memorability of the name, the ability for someone to actually convert what they hear into typing and going to the domain name. And those are all so critical for a company. And a lot of people say, well, now it's just Google, right? But people need to know what to go into Google and type and search for to find your company name. And I think most of us would prefer people to come directly to our website than go through an intermediary, which might show ads for competitors or push us down the page, that sort of thing. So it's more critical, I think, than ever to have a good quality domain name. And again, there's the left side of the dot, the second level domain, as we call it, and then the top level domain to the right. And there's a lot more choice now in what you have to the right of the dot. And it used to just be .com. Now there are over 1,000 extensions you can choose from. But I would just caution people to be careful about what they choose other than .com. And that can add to confusion. There are some benefits to these alternative top level domains, and that you can usually find a better second level domain to go along with it. But there is a true confusion factor, I think, for a lot of people that aren't used to these new domain name extensions to the right of the dot. So you should be careful when going with one of those other names. So it's not to say you shouldn't do it, but just understand some of the risks that come along with that.
Yeah, I mean, .com is kind of like the gorilla, 800-pound gorilla. If you can get the .com, like, you win. You're right. Like, but I think there's not a lot of great .com domains out there anymore. You got to be pretty creative or buy one.
Right.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, and so there are over 150 million .com domains registered now. So you're right. It is difficult to find a good one available. But you talk about buying them, and I think what a lot of people do is when they see the name is taken, they just move on. Mm-hmm. But you can buy existing domain names fairly affordably. Now, you're not going to be able to buy like a one-word .com domain name affordably. Mm-hmm. Those are mostly going to be 100,000 or even into the millions, depending on what the name is. But 2-word .coms, 3-word .coms, even some short ones, these typically sell for between $1,000 and $5,000, which, if you're starting up a business, you're doing marketing, you're creating a website, and you think about the fact that your domain name is going to be with you forever, right? And so if you kind of amortize that in your mind over 5, 10, 15 years, that's really not that much money for your domain name. And then once you buy it, the renewal fee is whatever you typically pay for a .com domain, so $10 or $20. So I'd really encourage people to not stop just because a name is taken and say, oh, let me move on to another name, but investigate and see if it is available for purchase at a price that's reasonable to you, and when you consider your full startup costs for your business.
Yeah, definitely.
Makes sense.
I know that like software companies, a lot of software companies have gone to the .io extension.
Right. .io, .ai is really popular right now too.
Oh yeah.
And the interesting thing about those extensions, anytime you see a 2-letter domain extension like that, that's a country code domain name. And so those actually kind of belong to a country. .ai is for Anguilla, which is a small island nation, like very small. I want to say they have like 25,000 people.
Wow.
And IO is for the British Indian Overseas Territory. And so those domains aren't regulated the same way a .com domain is regulated. And so you just need to be aware of that when you go for one of those domain names. Make sure it's a stable name. Make sure they don't change, they aren't changing names on you a lot. I know the Bitly URL shortener that everyone's familiar with, they were using a .ly domain name, which was for Libya, which I don't, not necessarily where I'd want my name. And Notion, started on Notion.so, which was Somalia. And so the stability there is not necessarily what you get with a .com, or even some of the better known country code domains like .us or .de for Germany. It's interesting. We in the United States think of .com as king, but you go to some European countries and you're more likely to see their country code name. I remember being in the Czech Republic, or I guess referred to as Czechia now, but .cz was what you saw everywhere. And if you go to, even in the UK, .com is more prevalent, but you'll see a lot of .uk domain names there. Our neighbors to the north have .ca. You'll see a lot of that if you're traveling around Canada. So, but in the United States, of course, .com is king. And if you're taking customers from everywhere, that's probably where you default to, right? Is what your domain extension is.
Right. Any other strategies for an e-commerce website that you can think of off the top of your head, just high level?
When it comes to domain names? Yeah, I would think, I know there might be some opportunities to register multiple domain names to test different conversion paths, like maybe when you're running ads on AdWords, having something where the right of the dot is really compelling to what you're selling, right? So if you're selling clothing, a .clothing domain and things like that. So it might just grab more attention from people than a .com might. So using that as kind of a path. Also, if you're promoting on social media and you have a link shortener, using something there that might be kind of fun and interesting that's related to what your brand is. And so that's an area where you're less concerned about kind of the confusion side of it, right? Because people are clicking through on a link, and you can actually add some brandability and some context by using a different top level domain name along with your second level domain. And again, in some of these alternative extensions, you can oftentimes get a better second level domain that might be interesting and compelling.
Right. So do you have any correlations between the top level and second level for e-commerce in terms of the correlation between the domain and the success? For example, a .shop.
Right. Yeah. There's .shop. There's .store. There are a lot of alternatives now that I think are great for e-commerce. But one thing to think about there is their shop and store. Can your consumer remember that, right? If they're going to it, can they remember the difference here? And there are a lot of these different extensions here. I do think one thing that's compelling about shop and store is it tells people that they can buy something online when they go there, right? Mm-hmm. So it is an interesting name for an e-commerce company. And again, this could be what you use as your domain name, especially if maybe you're a brand that's not just e-commerce, but you're selling merchandise, right? So maybe you want to go do, maybe you're an artist or a cartoonist, and you have a site that is, or even a podcaster, you have a site that you use for your main thing, but then you have a merch store or something like that. I think using a .store or .shop for that is a great way to kind of differentiate. And rather than just having it on your main website, maybe your main website links to that e-commerce store. But if you do want to have kind of a separate presence there, I think using something like that is interesting. It tells people that this is where I go to buy the merchandise. It's pretty clear based on that top level domain, based on that extension. So there are a lot of unique things you can do there. And we're talking, there are over 1,000 of these extensions. You can get I think it's .plumbing. It might be .plumber. I think it's .plumbing. There's .lighting, right? So there's something for just about everything out there. So you can have some fun with that and do something that really reiterates and defines what your brand is about.
Of course, the flip side of that is you can't grow beyond it. If you create a .plumbing and you want to also get into roofing or HVAC or whatever,
that's exactly
you're kind of
right.
stuck with that plumbing.
We see that on second level domains too, right? If you're jerrysplumbing.com, then you expand your services, right? Electrical, that sort of thing. It does kind of pigeonhole you. And, can you imagine if Amazon.com had been called books.com, and then when they would have had to change their brand over time, right? And so that is actually a really good point when it comes to choosing your name. Is you don't want to you don't want to get too specific if there's any chance that you might expand beyond what you're doing right now.
It's a big problem I see with businesses, whether it be brick and mortar or e-commerce all the time. They really do get pigeonholed. And then they realize, there's a whole nother world out there, all these other opportunities, products, services, channels that we can get into, but they've so pigeonholed themselves into a word or a concept that it's really hard to break out of that. And I think that's why a lot of companies are going with generic names these days that really don't say specifically any particular industry or vertical. It's just a word.
Or they're not even real words. They just make up a word.
Right.
Yeah. Which is one way you can go there. But again, I would, if you do that, make sure that people understand what the word is and can spell it. That's where the radio test comes in, where I would literally call 5 of your friends on the phone. Don't text them, call them. Or meet them in public at the coffee shop, whatever, and say, hey, I'm thinking about starting a site. It's called blah, blah, blah. And then wait 30 seconds, say something else and say, what was the name I told you? And how would you spell it? Right. So there could be some benefits to going up with something made up. There, in some cases, it can be easier to trademark them. A generic or descriptive term can be more difficult to trademark. So there is some value there. But something like shopper approved, it's not like I don't hear that and I'm like, okay, it's related to online shopping, but you can do a lot with that, right? As opposed to ratings.com or even, I don't want to name some companies that might be your competitors, but some specific words that are kind of limiting, right?
Yeah. So let's talk about trademarks for a minute. I know, like, when I look for domains, one of the first things I do is, one, see what's available. But then when I find one, I go to the U.S. trademark website and do a search. Is that something that you do? And do you do anything else to try to make sure a domain is safe to buy?
Yeah, so I did this recently for I'm creating a new website, and I looked up a bunch of names. In fact, rather than going to GoDaddy and typing in names, I just went to one of the marketplaces to buy an existing domain because I figured, again, let me use the creativity of someone else who's come up with a name. And there were a number of steps I took. So I came up with about 10 names. I showed them to friends to get their opinions on them. In addition, and then I did look up trademarks. And in fact, before I settled on a name, I reached out to a trademark attorney to run a more in-depth search to make sure I wasn't going to come across anything. Because that could be really bad if you start your site. Here you are a couple of years down the road, you've invested a lot into this brand, and then you get a trademark, cease and desist or a lawsuit or something like that. But I'd also say Google is one of your best trademark databases. Just because someone... you don't have to necessarily register a trademark to have a trademark, right? You can have a common law trademark. And so if you type in the term and all the Google results are for the same company, and it's kind of a term that you've made up or you put 2 words together, that's a pretty bad sign that there might be some trademark issues there. So just going into Google. And then you also want to go into Google to make sure that you're going to be able to rank for your specific brand. And so if there are a lot of companies in different industries, maybe that are taking up all these Google spots, that could create a challenge for you when it comes to being the number 1 or the number 2 search result there, right? So those are some things I would do before finalizing on a name. I know hiring a trademark attorney could be expensive. It doesn't have to be, but it's something that if you're really serious about your brand, I think it makes a lot of sense before you settle on a domain name. And then you can use that attorney to file trademark applications for you as well to prevent someone else from coming in and using that name.
Yeah. True. And when you're doing that Google search, you can use a free plugin from Moz or Ahrefs to see what the domain authority is, how many backlinks they have,
right?
The age of the domain, and really see like, okay, this is going to be easy or this is going to be almost impossible to outrank in search. If they have a high domain authority and a lot of backlinks, then you're not going to rank for those search terms, whether you can get the trademark or not.
Right. When I was looking for domains for this new site I'm starting up, one of them that I almost pulled the trigger on was $100,000. It was going to be a pretty big investment. But when I searched for the exact domain name in Google, the number one result was a competitor, and a very strong competitor. And I was like, well, I might be able to knock them down as I develop out this domain name, but they're still going to be in the number 2 spot. and I don't want that. Right. So
Right.
Those are certainly some things I would do before settling on your name.
Yeah. Don't make it more difficult than it needs to be.
Yeah. There are enough challenges, right?
It's already hard enough. Exactly.
Yeah, so I think that as a good kind of initial strategy, do some research, find several domains that could work. Go into Google, see what else is around that domain name, and if you think you could rank for it, and then go to the U.S. trademark website and do a search and see what's out there. And if there's any trademarks that are in your space specifically, like that's definitely something you need to watch for.
Yeah, and in your space is a key there, right? I mean, every word is probably trademarked by someone, but it might be for something else, right? And so, Amazon is probably trademarked for just about everything because they're a large company now, right? But if you're going with another generic term, someone might be using it for an electronics business, whereas you want to use it for something completely different, and
Right.
that's okay. There is Apple Computer, and I know there's like a car leasing company called Apple Leasing, and that's okay. They're in completely different segments.
Right.
So I say that's okay. Again, I'm not an attorney. You should probably talk to a trademark attorney. But even Apple famously, when they were doing trademarks, they had an issue around music and the term Apple. Because there was like a music studio or something called that. And they had a little bit of a challenge when they moved into music because of that.
Yeah, I remember reading about that. So with nearly 1,600 top-level domains or extensions, if you can't get a .com, what's the strategy you would recommend?
Yeah, so I guess my first strategy, if you want a .com, again, is to look at buying an existing name. And one thing there I'd say is go to one of these marketplaces like Afternic or Atom.com, ATOM, or Cedo and search for names there. But when it comes to picking those other extensions, I think you have those 2-letter country code domains. So you might look at what your competitors are using, whether it's IO or AI or Co. Some of these ones that are kind of generic in nature. But other than that, I would look at some of these extensions that might be relevant to you and add context. If you're a mortgage company, there is a .mortgage out there, but there's also .money, there's .finance. So something that adds kind of some context to what you do, much like an e-commerce store choosing .store or .shop for their brand. There's some other extensions that have become very popular for certain niches. For example, XYZ. .xyz is quite popular in the crypto space. So crypto companies might want to consider a name like that because it kind of shows that they're in with what people are doing in that space. And some of these are quite long, some of these extensions. So I would really think about, if you're choosing a longer domain extension, top level domain, making sure that you can get something short to the left of the dot. Because remember, it's not just someone typing this in to go to your website, but it's also going to be your email. And if you have to spell out something really long, or some people, if you have something long in your email address, maybe it's andrew.allemann@something.computer, that gets to be pretty long, right? So I would think about that as well. There are plenty of short domain extensions, top level domains, but there are some that are longer. And again, I would just say if you go with one of the longer ones, make sure that the second level domain name you can get is shorter.
Yeah, makes sense.
I think ideally keep everything as short as possible, right?
Yeah, in general, I think that's pretty good advice, but not at the expense of making it confusing, right? Like dropping vowels out of a word can be a major, Flickr, if you remember that online photo sharing service back in the day, it didn't have an E at the end. It was just, R.
Right.
And the guy who owned Flickr.com spelled correctly was getting hundreds of thousands of visitors a month to his domain name. So taking a shortcut like that does come with drawbacks.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. That's very true.
So what about like buying an existing domain? Is there value in that? Does that still apply?
Yeah. So I think there's value in two ways. One is buying an existing name is probably something that's probably going to be a better quality name than something you can go just register today. But the other thing is there can be value based on how that domain was used previously. So maybe it was used for a site related to what you're doing, and it has some links pointing to it already. So by using that name, you're kind of capturing that link juice. I would say those are kind of the two main reasons to buy an existing domain would be the existing authority you have. You mentioned some of those plugins, which will show domain authority and that sort of thing. But looking at the links that are pointing to that site, it can give you a head start. You might even consider buying an existing site in the space that isn't really maybe the people that buy it, they're doing it as a hobby or something on the side. Where if you buy that existing site and then redo it, right? So you can get the link authority they have. Maybe it already has some positive reputation, some positive consumer reviews, that sort of thing, and use that as a springboard. I think that's a great way to start. In fact, before I chose a domain name for my new business, I did try to buy a couple existing sites in the space. Ultimately, it wasn't fruitful, but I figured, hey, this is a way for me to kind of shortcut that process of building up a reputation and SEO value by buying an existing site. Now, obviously, you need to be careful when you do that. You want to look at the quality of those links, how they obtain those links, make sure there aren't any red flags with Google where there's negative reputation that can harm you, right? But I do think there's a lot of value in doing that, taking that approach.
Yeah, that makes sense. So besides the .coms and .orgs, is there a rule of thumb for the most credible, authoritative extensions or top-level domains?
Yeah, I don't think so. I would say .com is traditionally the most authoritative. If you're a nonprofit, .org. Used to be that .net was really big, but with all these other extensions coming along, that's changed. As you mentioned, in particular spaces, things have some authority like .io in the tech space. But beyond that, I would say that none of them have a really specific, strong reputation, unless, again, we're talking about countries. And so if you are, say, expanding into a country, I would do some research around what is authoritative there. In Germany, .de is authoritative. There are about 15 million .de names registered, maybe even more now. And for country the size of Germany, that's a lot of names, right? And so it's a very common usage over there. So understanding what the local economy uses, what they're used to. If you're expanding up to Canada, a .ca might be a good way to bifurcate that market. And of course, there are a couple different ways to do that. One is that you take all your traffic into your existing website and you just have localization options there for people to choose, which is one strategy that might make a lot of sense. Another one would be to create a different website using the local country domain for that country.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
Yeah, especially when you appear local and you're part of obviously the country, the currency, legal requirements, et cetera. You want to have that country extension.
Right. And we see this. I mean, Amazon has Amazon.ca, Amazon.co.uk, Amazon.de, right? They have all of these. And And you can apply localization to your domain based on IP addresses and that sort of thing. But as you mentioned, there are different rules and regulations in different places. So you might want to just have those specific to a particular domain name. The downside is your search engine side of things, right? Well, there's an upside and a downside there, right? One is that if people are searching for something in Germany, a .de domain name is a signal to Google that this is a German company and the person might be interested, especially if it's a localized search kind of that they're looking for. The downside is that you've got links maybe pointing to your .de domain, your .com domain, your .ca domain. So you're kind of spreading that link value across a lot of different domain names. So that can be challenging as well.
Awesome. Well, this has been really helpful. It's nice to actually talk to a domain name expert and get some validation for domains I've bought and things in the past.
I talked to lots of people who are like, yeah, I now have 100 names for ideas that I thought of, but that I no longer want. Which if that is the case, think about selling them. You can list them for sale. It's pretty easy to do it on sites like afternick.com and Cedo. And, you never know when someone will come along and pay you a few $1,000s for a name that you have no plans to use.
Yeah, I've done that. I've bought a lot of names. I've sold a lot of names. What a cool story, shopperapproved.com. So we were trying to figure out the name, right? And we came across that name, but it was taken, kind of like you were telling before. And I made an offer to the guy for like $2,500. And he's like, oh, yeah, well, I actually own like shopapproved.net, shopapproved.org. I have all the social media accounts already, and I'll just bundle those all in for you.
Nice.
So it was an awesome deal, like $2,500. And
it really is.
Like, that was a long time ago, but you can still get those kind of things.
Yeah. And there are, I sold a domain the other day. It was just a domain name. And then the person reached out to me because I saw I had a Facebook page for that domain, and I just handed it over to them. But you bring up one question I get a lot, which is, okay, I have the .com. Should I go register all these other extensions? And my advice used to be, yes, at least go get the .net and the .org. But that's changed because there's no way you're going to go out there and register 1,600 extensions, right? You just can't afford to do it. So my advice now is to get ones that might be particularly relevant to your industry. So if you're a financial business, maybe go register the .finance or the .money domain. Maybe go get the .org, maybe the .net, but it's just not as important as it used to be because it's frankly not as feasible as it used to be to get all those extensions. So get what you can within reason, but don't break the bank on all these other extensions if you have the one you want.
Right. Yeah. And especially when you're just starting out.
Yeah.
We have over the years, we've bought like misspellings.
Yes.
I think that's valuable.
Right. Yeah, it is. Especially if you have a name. You'll figure out pretty quickly how people are misspelling your name, right? Someone will say, I emailed you, you didn't get it. And then you're like, well, what did you send it to? And that sort of thing. And that makes a lot of sense, especially if you're a consumer facing brand. And you want to keep an eye too, if you become a bigger company, making sure that no one's trying to take advantage of your brand with some of these typos and misspellings. Because especially on email, that gets really risky if people are sending email to someone else that's meant for you, right? Yeah. And then you've got phishing and all that sort of stuff. Right. So I would say as you get bigger, you want to invest more and more domain names, whether that's alternative spellings, maybe some alternative extensions, maybe some country code names, getting over to those so that you can protect your brand in other countries.
Right.
Awesome. Your example about Flickr too is a really relevant one,
right?
And how that probably cost them a lot more than they originally anticipated.
Exactly. You might save some money up front, but you're going to pay for it in the long run.
That's right. Lost business and traffic,
right?
And probably links and everything else too.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, this has been awesome, Andrew. Thanks for your time, man. We usually end with our $1 million question.
Okay.
And that is, as an expert in your industry, what's one actionable strategy that you could recommend that would have the biggest impact on an e-commerce company right now if they're buying domain names?
Yeah, I would say if you're just starting out, to really look at getting something that you think you can stick with for the long run, right? And so I would say that that actionable thing that I would do if I'm looking for a business is, rather than coming up with names and typing them into a registrar to see if they're available, go to a marketplace and look at an existing name that you can buy. It's already listed. Maybe it has a buy now price somewhere in your budget. For a lot of people just starting out, that's $1,000 to $5,000, something like that. And getting a name that you really think you can grow with, rather than something that you're always going to be looking at saying, oh, I really wish I had this domain or that domain.
Mm-hmm.
Love it.
Good advice. Well, Andrew, thanks again for joining us. How can people follow you, connect with you?
Sure. Yeah. If you get excited about domain names, which I know sounds a little bit weird, but check out my site at domainnamewire.com. There are over 15,000 posts about domain names. You can see which names are selling. You can find out what's going on in the business, and maybe get some tips and tricks that'll help you out with your site.
Fantastic. You are an expert, and the person that people should be talking to if they have questions or need help or consultation with their domain name, top or second level. And thanks for joining us again on the E-commerce Traffic and Conversion Podcast. And don't forget to go to reputationking.com and download your free copy of Reputation King. And we look forward to seeing you next week. Take care.
Thanks.